Natalie Brooks stared at the two coffee mugs the cashier held above the counter. "Would you like the blue one or the green one?" The blue mug was the color of a quiet morning sky, while the green one reminded her of leaves after rain. They were identical except for the color, and each cost $6.99. It should have been the simplest decision in the world. Behind her, a shopping cart squeaked. Someone shifted impatiently. A little boy asked his mother for a candy bar, while the cashier continued smiling, completely unaware that the woman standing in front of her wasn't trying to choose between two coffee mugs at all. "Man?" Natalie's fingers tightened around her wallet. Blue or green? She tried to picture herself carrying one home. But before she could imagine either mug sitting on her kitchen counter, another voice crowded into the silence. Richard would have called the green one cheap. Knowing Richard, he probably would have criticized the blue one instead, said it looked childish, or asked why she needed another mug when there were perfectly good cups already in the kitchen. It almost didn't matter which criticism he chose. The important thing was that there would always have been one. So Natalie waited for the answer she had been trained to hear, waiting for someone outside herself to tell her which choice was safe. Nothing came. For the first time, there was only silence. Her breathing became shallow. "I'm sorry." The cashier lowered the mugs a little, her smile becoming gentler. "That's okay. Take your time." Those words landed harder than the question itself, because "take your time" assumed the time belonged to Natalie. It assumed the choice belonged to Natalie. It assumed there wasn't a wrong answer waiting somewhere beyond the checkout line that would make her regret whichever mug she carried home. For a woman who had spent 23 years believing every decision could become another reason to be criticized, those simple words felt almost impossible to understand. Before she realized it, tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, stepping away from the counter before either mug could be placed into a bag. She walked quickly toward the exit, wiping her face before anyone had the chance to ask what was wrong. The cashier watched her leave. The people waiting in line saw a woman who had become overwhelmed by something as ordinary as choosing a coffee mug. What they couldn't possibly see was that Natalie Brooks had spent 23 years learning that every decision carried a consequence, and that even the smallest choice could become evidence that she had failed. 6 months earlier, she had finally walked away from the man who taught her that lesson. She honestly believed that leaving would be the end of her story. She was about to discover it was only the place where her real life finally began. The first morning Natalie woke in her new apartment. She opened her eyes before the alarm sounded and lay perfectly still, listening. Pale sunlight stretched across a bare wall. A cardboard box sat unopened beside the closet, and somewhere in the building, water moved quietly through old pipes. She waited for footsteps that never came, for cabinet doors that never slammed, for the familiar voice demanding to know why she was still in bed. Only after the silence held its ground did she turn toward the clock. It was 5:42. Richard would have been awake by now. Coffee at 6, breakfast at 6:15, the kitchen clean before she left for work at the public library. That routine had governed her mornings for so long that her body still prepared to obey it, even though the man who created it was no longer there. His coffee was no longer her responsibility. His moods were no longer the weather she had to predict before placing her feet on the floor. Yet as Natalie pulled the blanket a little closer around herself, she realized freedom felt nothing like she had imagined. During the final year of her marriage, she had pictured this morning countless times. In every private fantasy, she woke in a place of her own, took one deep breath, and immediately felt lighter. Instead, the silence frightened her because she no longer knew what to do when no one else was deciding the day for her. The apartment itself was small but kind. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen with cream-colored cabinets, a living room just large enough for the second-hand sofa Marcus had helped carry inside. Emma had found the apartment online after weeks of searching, and Mrs. Delgado from the library had donated 2 lamps and a dining table she no longer needed. Everyone who loved Natalie kept calling it a fresh start. Natalie looked at the boxes stacked against the wall and saw something entirely different. She saw 23 years reduced to 3 suitcases, 8 cardboard boxes, a borrowed table, and a bank account that finally carried only her name. She saw the dining room set she had saved for, the little garden she had planted beside the back fence. The photographs Richard refused to let her take because, according to him, they belonged in the family house. Other people looked around the apartment and saw a possibility. Natalie saw everything she couldn't bring with her. She lowered herself to the edge of the bed and whispered into the quiet, "What now?" No one answered. Strangely, that frightened her too. The first empty day, Saturday, arrived at the end of Natalie's first week alone, and she woke at 6, already searching for something she was supposed to do. Laundry, groceries, cleaning, bills. Richard had assigned purpose to every hour of every weekend, and even rest required permission. So Natalie washed the same 4 towels she had washed only 3 days earlier, scrubbed the bathroom sink until it shined, wiped every kitchen counter, and rearranged the cans in the cupboard, simply because she couldn't think of anything else that needed doing. By 9:30, the apartment was spotless. The rest of the day stretched ahead of her like unfamiliar country. She stood in the middle of the living room, wearing an old gray sweatshirt, and stared at the clock. No one needed lunch. No one had left her a list. No one would question where she went if she walked out the front door. She lowered herself onto the sofa, managed to sit there for barely 3 minutes, then stood again because resting still felt dangerous. Richard had always called it laziness. If he found her sitting while something remained undone, he could recite every task she had supposedly neglected until she believed she had failed him all over again. Trying to quiet her thoughts, Natalie picked up a magazine Emma had left on the coffee table. She read the same paragraph 4 times without remembering a single word. Around noon, her phone rang. "What are you doing today, Mom?" Natalie looked around the silent apartment before answering. "Just catching up on a few things. Do you want to meet me for lunch?" Without thinking, Natalie searched for Richard's approval before remembering she no longer needed it. The realization was so unexpected she almost laughed, but the laugh disappeared as quickly as it came, because guilt arrived right behind it. Emma had waited years for this day. She had searched for apartments, gathered important documents, stood beside her mother at the bank while she opened her first account in her own name, and celebrated every small step that brought her closer to freedom. Natalie told herself she should have been happy by now. She should have been grateful. She certainly shouldn't still be afraid. "I don't want to interfere with your plans," she said. "You're not interfering. I'm inviting you. You don't have to rearrange your day for me." "Mom." Emma's voice softened. "Do you want to have lunch with me?" The question sounded so simple. Natalie discovered she didn't know how to answer it because she was still searching for the response someone else would approve of instead of the one that belonged to her. When she finally spoke, the old habit answered first. "Whatever you want is fine." There was a gentle silence before Emma spoke again. "I know," she said. "But what do you want?" Natalie turned toward the window, buying herself another moment because she genuinely didn't know. Across the street, a woman walked a little brown dog while leaves stirred in the late morning breeze, and traffic moved through the neighborhood as though the world had never learned to be afraid. "I don't know," Natalie admitted quietly. The words embarrassed her. Emma didn't rush to rescue the silence or answer the question for her. Finally, she smiled and said, "Then let's just try lunch. If you don't feel like staying, we'll leave." Natalie agreed. It wasn't really a choice yet, but for the first time in a very long time, she had taken the smallest step toward learning how to make one. The first grocery trip. At the grocery store, Natalie pushed her cart more slowly than everyone else. For years, Richard had given her a strict weekly budget, and every trip home ended the same way. He spread the receipt across the kitchen counter and questioned every purchase he considered unnecessary. Why this brand? Why that amount? Why did chicken cost more this week? Why did you buy strawberries when apples were cheaper? Eventually, Natalie stopped shopping like someone buying food and started shopping like someone trying to avoid making a mistake. Every aisle became a field she crossed carefully, watching for traps she could not always see. Now she carried her own debit card. Her paycheck went into her own account. No one would stand at the kitchen counter waiting to inspect the receipt. Even so, every item she placed into the cart still felt like evidence she might someday have to defend. When she reached the cereal aisle, her eyes settled on a box of maple pecan granola. She had looked at that cereal for years without ever buying it because Richard said it was overpriced, full of sugar, and a waste of money. He bought bran flakes in bulk and expected Natalie to eat them too. She lifted the box from the shelf and turned it over. $5.49. She could afford it now. She placed it carefully into the cart, but almost as soon as she did, her heart began racing the way it always had whenever she spent money Richard might question. 2 aisles later she stopped, turned the cart around, walked back to the cereal aisle, and quietly returned the granola to the shelf, before finishing her shopping as though nothing unusual had happened. That evening, Marcus stopped by to install a shelf in the bathroom. While searching the cupboard for a glass, he noticed the familiar box of bran flakes. "You still eat those?" Natalie glanced toward the cupboard. "They're practical." Marcus looked back at her. "Do you like them?" The question caught her completely off guard. "There's nothing wrong with them. I didn't ask that." He filled his glass with water, then looked at her again with the same quiet patience. "I asked if you like them." Natalie lowered her eyes to the grocery receipt she had already folded once, then folded again, buying herself a few more seconds, because she genuinely didn't know how to answer. After a long silence, she finally whispered, "I don't know." Marcus simply nodded as though that answer made perfect sense, never trying to rescue her from it or tell her what she should have said. The following Saturday, Natalie found herself standing in the same cereal aisle, looking at the same box of maple pecan granola. This time, she picked it up, placed it in her cart, and kept walking. The next morning, she poured herself a bowl and carried it to the little table by the window, where sunlight warmed the room in a way she was only beginning to notice. The cereal was sweeter than she expected. She smiled anyway. It wasn't the granola that made her smile. It was the simple fact that, for the first time in years, she had chosen it herself. The first mistake. 3 weeks after moving into the apartment, Natalie burned dinner. She had been reading a library book while something simmered on the stove, and by the time she smelled smoke, the fire alarm had already exploded into the apartment. Natalie jumped from her chair, rushed into the kitchen, pulled the pan from the burner, threw open the window, and waved a towel beneath the alarm until her hands shook so badly she dropped it onto the floor. A moment later, someone knocked. When she opened the door, Mrs. Evelyn Carter stood in the hallway wearing a purple robe and fuzzy slippers. "Everything all right?" Natalie looked back toward the blackened pan. "I'm sorry." Mrs. Carter blinked. "For what?" "The alarm. I disturbed you." "You burned dinner, honey. You didn't burn down the building." Natalie waited for the disappointment she knew so well. Instead, Mrs. Carter walked past her, pushed the kitchen window open a little farther, and laughed. "That alarm could wake the dead. Mine went off last month because I forgot biscuits in the oven." Natalie looked at her in surprise. "You forgot them?" "I got distracted watching a game show." Mrs. Carter peered into the pan. "I don't believe that chicken survived." Natalie stared at the blackened dinner while another voice echoed through her memory. Richard would have called her careless. He would have stood in the kitchen explaining how much food cost, how hard he worked, and how she always managed to waste something. For a moment, she could almost hear him, but instead, Mrs. Carter picked up the towel and kept fanning beneath the alarm as though burned dinners were simply part of being human. "You have anything else to eat?" she asked. "I could make a sandwich. I have vegetable soup." "You don't have to." "I know," Mrs. Carter said with a warm smile. "That's why it's called an invitation." 10 minutes later, they were sitting together at Natalie's little dining table, eating soup from mismatched bowls while the burned pan soaked quietly in the sink. Natalie kept waiting for the conversation to change, for the criticism to arrive, for someone to explain how careless she had been or how much money she had wasted. But it never happened. Nothing terrible happened. No lecture came. No one listed her failures. No one punished her for making a mistake. Natalie looked toward the ruined chicken, and before she realized it, she started laughing. Mrs. Carter smiled. "What's so funny?" "I burned dinner." "Yes," she laughed, "you certainly did." Natalie laughed even harder until Mrs. Carter joined in, although she had no idea why the moment felt so extraordinary. Natalie knew. For the first time in more than 20 years, she had made a mistake and remained completely safe. The pattern was still living inside her. At the library, Natalie spent her days helping other people believe they were capable. She patiently showed frightened children how to find books, helped job seekers complete online applications, and never made elderly patrons feel embarrassed for asking the same question twice. She offered strangers a kindness and patience she almost never extended to herself. One afternoon, Mrs. Delgado asked Natalie to step into their office. Before Natalie even reached the chair, her stomach tightened. She replayed the entire day in her mind, searching for the mistake she must have made. Had she come back late from lunch? Misfiled a book? Forgotten to record something? Mrs. Delgado quietly closed the office door, smiled, and said, "I wanted to talk to you about the community literacy program." Natalie sat perfectly still. "What did I do?" Mrs. Delgado looked genuinely confused. "You didn't do anything." Natalie forced a smile. "Of course. I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize. I know." But before the conversation ended, she apologized again. Mrs. Delgado explained that she wanted Natalie to lead a weekly reading circle for women returning to education after long absences. "You're good at helping people feel comfortable," she said. "I think you'd be excellent." Natalie answered almost immediately, not with excitement, but with a list of reasons someone else should do it instead. She didn't have a degree. She had never led a program before. She was only a library assistant. Every reason came so quickly it sounded rehearsed, as though she had been preparing to reject herself long before anyone else had the chance. Mrs. Delgado listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question Natalie couldn't answer. "Are those your reasons, or are they things someone taught you to believe about yourself?" Natalie didn't respond. She couldn't. That evening, she sat alone in her car outside the apartment building, long after turning off the engine, hearing the question again and again. "Are those your reasons, or someone else's?" Richard had never stood in front of Natalie and forbidden her from becoming more. He had done something far quieter, and in many ways far more devastating. Year after year, he explained why she wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't organized enough, wasn't confident enough, wasn't educated enough. She was too emotional, too disorganized, too easily overwhelmed, too old to go back to school, too inexperienced to apply for promotions. He repeated those judgments so often that they slowly stopped sounding like opinions. They became facts. Eventually, they became the way Natalie described herself, until she could no longer remember where his voice ended and hers began. That was one of the cruelest discoveries of recovery. Richard no longer stood beside her telling her who she was. He didn't have to. Somewhere along the way, his voice had learned to speak from inside her, and every time she doubted herself, apologized for existing, or quietly decided someone else was more qualified, it sounded so much like her own thoughts that she no longer recognized where they had come from. Pattern definition moment. One of the hardest truths about recovering from coercive control is that leaving the relationship does not immediately silence the control. A survivor may walk out the front door and still carry years of conditioning into every ordinary decision she makes. She may hesitate before spending her own money, apologize for needs that require no apology, fear mistakes no one will punish, distrust peaceful moments, or feel guilty the instant she experiences joy. None of that means she is weak, and none of it means leaving failed. It means survival taught her habits that once helped her endure an unsafe life, but no longer belong in a safe one. Recovery is not forgetting what happened. Recovery is slowly recognizing which thoughts are truly yours, which fears were planted by someone else, and giving yourself permission, one choice at a time, to stop living by rules that no longer exist. Freedom begins the day she leaves. Reclamation begins the day she realizes she no longer has to keep obeying the voice she escaped. The first picture. A few days later, Emma arrived carrying a wrapped picture for the living room wall. "I thought this would look good above the sofa." Natalie peeled away the paper and found a field of yellow flowers stretching beneath a wide blue sky. She held the frame against the wall and smiled uncertainly. "It's bright." Emma smiled back. "You always liked yellow." Natalie looked at her daughter. "Did I?" The question caught Emma by surprise. "When I was little, you wore a yellow dress to my school concert," she said softly. "You told me it made you feel like sunshine." Natalie searched her memory until another one quietly pushed its way forward. Richard hated that dress. He said yellow drew too much attention and wasn't flattering on her. So she stopped wearing it, and somewhere over the years, she stopped noticing she had stopped. "I forgot," she whispered. Together they measured the wall, hammered in a nail, and hung the picture above the sofa. It leaned just enough for Natalie to notice immediately, and without thinking, she reached toward it to straighten it. Then she paused. "Leave it." Emma looked at her with a small smile. "Are you sure?" Natalie smiled back. "No." She stepped away from the wall and studied the crooked picture for another moment. "But I think I want to find out what happens if something stays imperfect." The picture stayed that way for 3 days. On the 4th morning, Natalie straightened it, not because she was afraid someone would criticize it, but because after looking at it for 3 days, she decided she genuinely wanted it straight. That difference mattered. The first no. A week later, Mrs. Carter invited Natalie to dinner with a small group of women from the building. Natalie's first instinct was to refuse. Social invitations had always required Richard's approval, and even when he allowed her to go, she spent the entire evening watching the clock and wondering what mood would be waiting at home when she returned. Mrs. Carter never rushed her. "I'd like to come," Natalie finally said. The dinner was wonderfully ordinary. The women talked about work, grandchildren, rising rent, recipes, and a television drama Natalie had never watched. No one questioned her marriage. No one asked why she stayed. No one expected her to relive her pain in order to earn a place at the table. Near the end of the evening, Cheryl asked if Natalie could help organize a tenant meeting the following Saturday. The answer was already forming before Natalie had time to think. "Of course. Whatever you need. I can rearrange my plans." That was the answer she had given for years. Then another thought quietly interrupted the old one. Mrs. Delgado had given her materials for the literacy program. She had promised herself she would spend the weekend preparing. Natalie took a slow breath. "I'm sorry." She stopped, surprised she had almost apologized before she had even answered. Cheryl waited patiently. "I can't help Saturday." "All right," Cheryl said with an easy smile. "Maybe next time." And then everyone simply went back to their conversation. Natalie barely heard another word because she kept waiting for the moment she knew so well, the disappointment that always grew into criticism, the accusation that she was selfish, difficult, or ungrateful for putting herself first. It never came. By the time she and Mrs. Carter started walking home, Natalie couldn't hold the question inside any longer. "I said no." "I know. I didn't explain why." Mrs. Carter nodded. "No." Natalie looked at her. She wasn't angry. Mrs. Carter smiled. "People are allowed to be disappointed, Natalie. That doesn't mean you did something wrong." Natalie said nothing for the rest of the walk. She carried Mrs. Carter's words home with her, repeating them quietly as she unlocked the apartment door, again while the kettle warmed for tea, and once more before turning out the bedroom light. "People are allowed to be disappointed. That doesn't mean I did something wrong." For the first time, she wondered whether she had spent 23 years confusing someone else's disappointment with her own responsibility. The first night she slept. For months, Natalie woke at every sound. A door closing, somewhere in the hallway. A car pulling into the parking lot. A man's voice outside. Long before her mind remembered she was safe, her body remembered danger. One rainy Thursday evening, she came home exhausted after leading her first literacy circle. She had almost turned the opportunity down, convinced someone else would be better, but instead, she had spent the evening sitting around a library table with 6 women who were finding the courage to learn again. One woman, 62 years old, struggled through a paragraph before finally reaching the last sentence. She lowered the page, tears filling her eyes. "I did it," she whispered. Natalie reached across the table and smiled. "Yes, you did." That night, she warmed a bowl of soup, read for a while on the sofa, and climbed into bed without checking the locks a second time. When she opened her eyes again, sunlight filled the room. The clock read 7:18. Natalie sat upright in alarm before realizing it was Saturday morning. She had slept through the entire night. No nightmares had pulled her awake. No footsteps had sent her listening. No waiting for Richard's key to turn in the lock. She lowered both feet to the floor and quietly began to cry, because not every tear meant she was falling apart. Some tears meant her body had finally accepted what her mind had been trying to believe for months. She was safe. The first grief recovery didn't move in a straight line. 2 days after sleeping through the night, Natalie opened a library book she had brought from the family house and found an old photograph tucked between the pages. She and Richard stood beside a lake during the first year of their marriage. Natalie was 23 years old, wearing a yellow shirt and laughing at something just beyond the edge of the picture. She looked so young, so hopeful, so completely unaware of how many pieces of herself she would surrender, one small compromise at a time, until she could no longer remember who she had been before giving them away. Natalie sat down on the kitchen floor, with the photograph still in her hands. She cried for the young woman in the yellow shirt. She cried for the years she would never get back. She cried because leaving had not returned her youth, her old home, or the version of motherhood she wished Emma and Marcus had experienced. When Emma called that evening, Natalie almost said she was fine. Instead, she answered honestly, "I'm having a hard day." Emma arrived with takeout, and they ate together on the kitchen floor, because Natalie still hadn't moved from where she found the photograph. "I should be grateful," Natalie said quietly. "I got out. Some women never do." Emma looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You can be grateful and still grieve. I wasted so much time." Emma picked up the photograph. "You survived for a long time. That isn't the same as living." "No," Emma said gently, "but surviving is what gave you the chance to live now." Natalie leaned against her daughter. Recovery never asked her to pretend the past hadn't cost her something. It asked something much gentler. That she refused to let everything it had already taken also decide the rest of her life. The first flower spring arrived slowly, and one afternoon on her way home from work, Natalie found herself pulling into a garden center for no reason she could explain. Inside the greenhouse, rows of flowers stretched beneath the glass roof. Red geraniums, purple petunias, white daisies, and bright yellow marigolds that seemed to catch the afternoon sunlight. An employee smiled as she approached. "Can I help you find something?" Natalie's first instinct was to say she was only looking, but instead she reached out and gently brushed the edge of a marigold leaf. "I used to have a garden. What did you grow?" Natalie looked across the rows of flowers for a long moment before answering. "I don't remember what I liked." The employee smiled with an understanding that asked for nothing more. "Then this is a good place to find out." Natalie wandered through the greenhouse for nearly an hour, stopping wherever something caught her eye, until she finally chose 2 pots of yellow marigolds for the apartment windowsill. At the register, she realized something that surprised her. She hadn't once imagined Richard calling the flowers wasteful. She hadn't rehearsed an explanation for spending the money. She had simply chosen something she liked, paid for it, carried it home, and placed it beneath the picture Emma had given her. The apartment didn't change overnight, but every time Natalie looked toward the windowsill she smiled, because something living now grew there for one simple reason. She had chosen it. No one had approved it. No one had criticized it. It was simply there because she wanted it to be, and somehow that made the little apartment feel more like home. The first future. By the end of summer, Emma and Marcus took Natalie out for her 47th birthday. The year before, Richard had chosen the restaurant, ordered her meal, and complained about the cost before dessert even arrived. This year, the server placed the menu in front of Natalie and simply asked, "What would you like?" Natalie smiled. She read every page without hurrying because for the first time in years, no one seemed impatient while she decided. After dinner, Marcus slid a brochure across the table. "What's this?" "The library offers tuition assistance," he said. Emma found a community college program in adult education. Natalie looked from one child to the other. "You two have been planning!" Emma laughed. "Only researching." Then she smiled. "The decision is yours." Natalie opened the brochure and slowly turned the pages. It described classes, college credits, and a certificate program in adult education, the very future she had quietly dismissed years earlier, because Richard had convinced her she simply wasn't academic enough to pursue it. "I'd be almost 50 when I finished." Marcus shrugged. "You're going to be almost 50 anyway." Natalie laughed, but the laughter faded as another thought quietly settled in. "What if I fail?" Emma reached across the table and rested her hand over Natalie's. "Then you'll know you tried something you chose." Natalie folded the brochure carefully and slipped it into her purse. For several weeks, it stayed there while she looked at it, thought about it, and quietly argued with herself. Then, one Monday morning, she opened the application, filled in every page, and found herself staring at the final screen. Submit application. Her finger rested above the button while she looked at the screen for a long time. No one was there to tell her to press it. No one was giving her permission. No one could promise she would succeed. Whatever happened after she clicked that button would belong to her alone. And for the first time in decades, that realization didn't frighten her. It made her smile. Then she pressed submit. The first time she forgot to be afraid. 9 months after leaving Richard, Natalie invited everyone to her apartment for dinner. Emma brought dessert. Marcus managed to burn the garlic bread. Mrs. Carter arrived carrying a bowl of salad, while complaining that the stairs were trying to kill her. The table was a little too small, the plates didn't match, someone spilled water on the floor, and the picture above the sofa had somehow become crooked again. Natalie stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to everyone laugh. At first she couldn't explain what felt different. Then she realized she wasn't listening for danger. She wasn't wondering who might become angry. She wasn't trying to prevent the next argument before it started. What filled the apartment wasn't silence. It was peace. The kind of peace that made room for mistakes, laughter, disagreements, spilled water, burned garlic bread, and people who could simply enjoy being together without anyone paying a price for it. "Mom," Marcus called from the table. "Are you coming?" Natalie carried the food into the dining room and joined them. It wasn't until they were halfway through dinner that she realized she hadn't looked at the clock once. She hadn't rehearsed an apology. She hadn't measured every word before speaking. For almost an entire evening, she had forgotten to be afraid. She never mentioned it. She simply looked around the table, quietly grateful, and let the moment belong to her. The first choice, again. Almost a year after walking away from the coffee mugs, Natalie found herself back in the same store. Earlier that morning, she had received her acceptance letter from the community college. Classes would begin in January, and the letter tucked safely inside her purse felt like proof of a future she was only beginning to believe belonged to her. As she wandered through the housewares aisle, she saw them, the blue mug, the green mug. For a moment, she remembered the woman who had stood in that same spot, unable to choose because every decision felt dangerous. A cashier arranging a nearby display looked up and smiled. "I remember you." Natalie smiled back. "I remember you too." The cashier picked up the mugs. "Did you ever decide which one you wanted?" Natalie reached for the blue mug first. Then she picked up the green one. "I'll take both." The cashier laughed. "Couldn't choose?" Natalie looked down at the mugs in her hands and smiled. "No." Then she looked back up. "I finally could." She carried both mugs home. The blue one became her morning coffee cup, and the green one held pens beside the table where she completed her first college assignments. Above the sofa hung the picture Emma had given her. Yellow marigolds bloomed on the windowsill. Books filled the shelves Marcus had installed. Nothing about the apartment was expensive or extraordinary, yet every corner quietly reflected a woman learning what she liked, what she valued, and who she was becoming. It no longer looked like the place where someone had landed after losing everything. It looked like home. Healing had not returned the years Natalie lost. It had given her something she had never truly possessed before, the freedom to choose her own future. For years, Natalie believed she was starting over too late, with too much fear and too little time. She wasn't starting over. Starting over would have meant living the same life again. Natalie was doing something entirely different. She was living a life she had never been free to live before. She was finally beginning. Dear hearts, recovery doesn't always arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes it looks like buying the cereal you've always wanted to try. Sometimes it looks like leaving a picture crooked because no one has to approve it but you. Sometimes it looks like burning dinner and discovering the world doesn't end. Sometimes it looks like saying no without explaining yourself, sleeping through the night, buying flowers simply because they make you smile, or making plans for a future you once believed belonged to someone else. Those may seem like small choices, but they aren't small to someone who spent years believing every choice required permission. If you're healing, please don't measure your progress by someone else's timeline. You're allowed to grieve what happened while still building what comes next. Healing isn't becoming the person you were before the abuse. Sometimes healing is finally meeting the person you never had the chance to become. Her story is fictional. The pattern is real. Dear hearts, if Natalie's story felt familiar, remember that leaving isn't the only victory. Every healthy boundary, every peaceful night, every honest answer, every small act of courage, and every choice that belongs to you is part of reclaiming your life. If you're hurting, tell someone, ask for help, and if you haven't already, subscribe and become part of our family. Each one of you matters. I'll see you in the next story.
Please don't forget to like this video, share with your friends, and leave a comment below. Subscribe, join the family, and let us know where you are watching and listening from. The lessons you learned, and your thoughts on how we can continue improving to give you the very best. Thank you.